June 1858, London, England. The sun rises on the greatest city on earth, the beating heart of an empire that spans the globe. But as the day heats up, a different kind of power awakens. A thick, visible miasma begins to rise from the River Thames. It is a smell beyond description, a cocktail of human excrement, industrial chemical waste, animal carcasses, and the rotten effluent of 2.5 million souls. It clings to clothes. It seeps into the drapes of Parliament. It forces handkerchiefs over the faces of the rich and poor alike. It is the great stink, and for 3 months it will not relent. It will become a weapon, an invisible, democratic, and utterly relentless chemical weapon that will do what decades of debate, cholera outbreaks, and moral pleas could not. It will force a paralyzed government to act. This is not a story about bad smells or public health. This is a story about how a civilization can ignore a mounting catastrophe for generations, until the catastrophe itself physically invades the halls of power and holds them hostage. This is the story of how London's ruling class was finally literally gassed into progress. The setup, the river that was a sewer. To understand the potency of the great stink, you must first understand the deliberate engineered insanity of London's sanitation in 1858. The Thames was not like a sewer, it was the sewer. For centuries, London had relied on a network of cesspools, basement pits that collected human waste. By the early 1800s, this medieval system was overwhelmed. The solution was the 1848 Metropolitan Commission of Sewers Act. It mandated the connection of house drains to the existing street sewers. A brilliant idea, with one catastrophic flaw. Those street sewers had been built centuries earlier to carry rainwater to the Thames. Now they dumped the entire city's raw sewage directly into the river. The Thames, a tidal river, became a slow-churning toilet bowl. At low tide, banks of putrid sludge were exposed. At high tide, the filth was stirred and pushed further upstream. The river, the city's main source of drinking water, was now a broth of pathogens. Disease was constant. Cholera epidemics in 1832, 1848, and 1854 killed tens of thousands. Physicians like John Snow were proving the link between contaminated water and disease, but the political and economic establishment resisted. Building a proper sewer system was unthinkably expensive. It would require tearing up the entire city. It was a problem for the poor, in the slums, out of sight. The city's leadership had perfected the art of ignoring a systemic crisis. They could ignore statistics. They could ignore the dead poor. They could ignore the moral arguments of reformers. But in the summer of 1858, the crisis decided to pay them a personal visit. The weaponization of air, the stink that could not be ignored. The summer of 1858 was one of the hottest and driest on record. The water level in the Thames dropped. The sewage concentrated, and then it began to bake. The result was a new kind of atmospheric terror, the miasma, the belief that bad smells themselves cause disease, was the prevailing medical theory. Whether it was scientifically correct or not was irrelevant. The ruling class believed the smell was a direct physical poison, and now that poison was everywhere. It was democratic. It filled the slums of Whitechapel and the palaces of Westminster equally. It was inescapable. Perfumed handkerchiefs were useless. Lime was scattered in the streets to mask it, turning to a foul paste. It was visible. Newspapers reported a pestilential fog hanging over the river. Most critically, it invaded the seat of power. The Houses of Parliament are situated directly on the Thames, in a building whose basement was essentially at river level. The stench poured through the windows. The curtains were soaked in lime chloride in a desperate attempt to block it. Debates were cut short as members retched. The politicians, the bankers, the aristocrats, the very men who had blocked sewer reform for a generation, were now trapped in their own chamber, being slowly, personally asphyxiated by the consequences of their own inaction. The abstract problem of public health had become a direct physical assault on the ruling class. They weren't reading about cholera in the poor districts anymore. They were drinking it, breathing it, drowning in it. The political breakthrough. when discomfort becomes an emergency. For years, a visionary engineer named Joseph Bazalgette had been pushing a radical plan, an intercepting sewer system, a network of massive egg-shaped brick tunnels that would run parallel to the Thames, collect all the waste, and carry it miles downstream, where it could be pumped out into the estuary at high tide. It was an undertaking of pharaonic scale and cost. The politicians had always balked. The price tag was astronomical, $3 million, over $400 million today. The disruption would be immense. But in July 1858, with the stench at its peak, something snapped. The discomfort turned to genuine panic. The Temporary Measures Act was rushed through. Parliament in just 18 days, a legislative speed record born of pure olfactory terror. It granted Bazalgette the authority, the money, and the sweeping powers of compulsory purchase to build his system. The bill passed not out of altruism, but out of self-preservation. The MPs weren't voting to save the poor from cholera. They were voting to save themselves from being gassed out of their own workplace. The Great Stink had achieved what 30,000 cholera corpses could not. It made the crisis personal for the decision-makers. Bazalgette was given carte blanche. His plan was no longer a proposal, it was a ransom payment to the river. Speaking of overwhelming forces that demand a systemic response, let's talk about the infrastructure of your documentary. You're constructing a film about this visceral, transformative event. You need audio that makes the audience feel the oppressive heat and the inescapable stench. You need the quiet, ominous lap of a polluted river, the buzzing of flies over sludge, the choked coughs in a grand hall, the frantic scratching of pens on emergency legislation. But sourcing that sound without wading through a murky bog of copyright issues can be its own foul process. That's where Epidemic Sound comes in. Think of it as your clean, filtered source for sound. A massive library of high-quality, royalty-free music and sound effects. No legal miasma, no hidden waste. Just pure, clear access to thousands of tracks, from oppressive, humid drones that feel like a sickly summer, to tense, urgent scores for political crisis, to the monumental industrial sounds of engineering triumph. Need the sound of a fly landing on a windowsill, the gagging breath of a man trying not to vomit, the colossal wet sound of a brick sewer arch being laid. They've got it. Their search tools help you drain away the noise and find the precise audio sample. Right now, Epidemic Sound is offering a free trial. Use the link in the description to access the library. Thanks to Epidemic Sound for sponsoring this dive into the foundations of the modern world. Now back to the digging and the man who would replumb a city. The engineering miracle, building the unseen city. What followed was the greatest civil engineering project of the 19th century. For the next 8 years, London was a vast construction site. Bazalgette's design was genius in its simplicity and foresight. The intercepting sewers, over 80 miles of main underground brick tunnels, running just behind the riverbanks. They caught the outflow from the old street sewers. The egg shape. The tunnels were egg-shaped, a design that ensured even a trickle of wastewater would maintain a flow velocity high enough to prevent sediment from building up and blocking the pipe. Pumping power. Massive steam-powered pumping stations, like the cathedral-like Crossness and Abbey Mills, lifted the waste so gravity could carry it east, doubling the capacity. In a legendary act of foresight, Bazalgette took the projected volume of London's sewage, calculated the pipe diameter needed, and then doubled it. He built for a city of the future. His sewers still form the backbone of London's system today. He wasn't just moving waste, he was re-engineering the city's metabolism. He was creating an invisible underground twin to the London above, a circulatory system for its filth that finally separated it from its water and its air. The project was brutal, dangerous work. Navvies, navigational engineers, dug by hand through soil, clay, and quicksand, often dying in tunnel collapses. But they built the immediate impact, the silence after the stink. The system came online in the mid-1860s. The effect was almost instantaneous. The Thames began to clear. The smell vanished. Fish returned to a river that had been biologically dead for decades. But the most profound impact was on human life. The cholera epidemic stopped. The last major outbreak in London was in 1866, in an area not yet connected to Bazalgette's network. It was the final grim proof of his system's necessity. Once connected, cholera disappeared from London for good. The Great Stink had weaponized the air to force action. Bazalgette's sewers performed the ultimate counterstrike. They weaponized cleanliness. They turned public health from a charitable notion into an engineered, guaranteed utility, as fundamental as water or gas. The unseen legacy, the blueprint for the modern city. The Great Stink and its aftermath did more than clean a river. It established the foundational principle of the modern metropolis: municipal responsibility for systemic sanitation. It proved that public health was not a private matter, but an infrastructure problem. It required centralized planning, massive investment, and enforceable standards. It created the model for public works departments everywhere. It also marked a shift in the relationship between government and population. For the first time on such a scale, the state undertook a project whose sole purpose was to protect the biological life of its citizens, rich and poor, from an environmental threat of its own creation. It was a quiet brick-and-mortar revolution. The revelation. So what was the Great Stink? The revelation is not that it led to sewers. The revelation is that the Great Stink was a moment of radical, involuntary democracy. It was the moment when the environmental consequences of industrial urban life, long dumped on the poor, became impossible to segment and finally breached the sensory barriers of the powerful. For decades, the ruling class had lived upstream, politically, economically, and literally, from the problem. They could ignore the contaminated water because they had access to cleaner sources. They could ignore the slums. They could intellectualize the cholera deaths. The Great Stink destroyed that distance. The wind and the tide carried the evidence, the aerosolized proof of systemic failure, directly into their lungs and their parliament. It was feedback the system could no longer ignore. The river itself became a revolutionary, forcing accountability through the most primal sense: smell. London didn't build sewers because it finally cared about its poor. It built sewers because the poor's condition had become a direct physical threat to the rich. The air, in its foul equality, became the great leveler. It was a crisis that refused to be marginalized. We live in the world Bazalgette built. Every time we flush a toilet without a second thought, we are beneficiaries of that hot, foul summer. It teaches us a brutal but effective lesson. Sometimes progress doesn't come from enlightenment. It comes from the unbearable discomfort of the powerful. It comes when the crisis stops being a statistic in a report and starts dripping from the curtains, stinging the eyes, and stopping the breath of the very people who have the power to fix it. The Great Stink was the day the city's waste declared war on its rulers. And in Neutschances, winning that war, the rulers for once saved everyone.